So I'm Ashley Sullivan. I work at the Illawarra South Coast region in the New South Wales State Emergency Service. I look after about 700 volunteers in 14 units, and my primary role is operations, planning for operations and also capability development within those units. If we look back in the recent August 2015 floods, we saw the rain develop within 4 hours. To us, that's technically a flash flood. The Shoalhaven is particularly at risk from floods because of the nature of the geography. What that creates is technically a very fast moving flood that can catch up on communities, as we saw recently. Because it's so quick, it's hard for us to get accurate information out because it's happening at the same time as the rainfall and the consequence. And you know, a lot of flash flooding can occur and does occur, usually before the riverine flooding. So a lot of roads, a lot of houses are actually on very low-lying areas that can be subject to overland flow, along with then riverine flooding at a later time. We can risk mitigate in terms of our building controls in where we build and how we build and what those structures look like. You can never eliminate the risk of flooding altogether.
On a daily basis, I'd typically be dealing with a lot of community members who might be putting in development applications, and so I'd be assessing those developments to see whether they're flood affected, and if they are, to make sure that they're building it in an appropriate manner. I also work with the Office of Environment and Heritage, which is a state government department preparing flood studies and floodplain risk management studies and plans. And they're the documents that identify areas in the Shoalhaven that are flood affected or aren't flood affected, and the risks associated with that flooding. So whether it's a house being flooded and inundated, or whether it's the roads around that house being cut off, and then we use that information to try and plan for a flood, to see what we need to do, what the SES needs to do. From that, we now have in the Shoalhaven 3 SES units, one in Nowra, one in Ulladulla, and a very new one in the St George's Basin / Sussex Inlet area. And they're the volunteers that are here to help evacuate people in the event of a flood. They also manage the evacuation centres, distributing supplies, livestock if people need help managing those. The SES are the people that are on call helping us, and they're all local members of our communities volunteering their time to help us in a time of emergency. Something that we have over a bushfire is that we can model where the flood goes, and we can see what roads are going to get cut, we can see what houses are going to be inundated, and because of that we can plan appropriately. So we can tell communities that your house is impacted. One of the things that I do on a daily basis is help project manage the flood studies and risk management studies and plans. So very briefly, a flood study simply looks at, if it rains, where does that water go? What is the flood extent? What properties are flooded? The risk study then looks at the risks associated with that. So if roads are cut, how many properties are being cut off at the same time? How many properties are being inundated? Are there any critical services that are being inundated, say a hospital, or vulnerable areas such as a childcare centre? And then the risk plan looks at, well, what are we going to do about that? So it's the planning phase that is going to make the issue better in the future. So things like looking at building levee banks, perhaps, to stop the water coming in over that riverbank or the lake bank. Having different development controls, so we assess development applications and we require habitable rooms, which is your bedrooms, your kitchen, your living areas, all to be above the flood planning level, so the 100-year flood plus a half a metre. So all of these things are done to try and make the community safer. So to either stop the flood from getting to the flood affected area, or to make it have less of an impact, or to allow the development to occur but in a safer way. So building it from different materials, building it higher up. The Shoalhaven River floodplain is one of the oldest, which is why the floodplain is so wide, because it's been flooded so many times and a long history of water flowing through it. Even with that open entrance, it's still flooded. and that's still something that we deal with today, that with a heavily shoaled entrance or a closed entrance, that it is still going to flood. So even with it opened and flowing out, it's not having that reducing impact, it's not stopping that flood.
There are large areas of the state that we're quite happy to let flood. That's their function, they're floodplains. What we're trying to do is manage the impacts of flooding on people. Flooding of agricultural land isn't too much of a problem, provided the farmers can get their stock out of the way. They'll occasionally lose crops, but they'll grow new crops. Towns placed in floodplains, on the other hand, can be a significant problem. Most towns in Australia have been built near rivers. They were built near rivers because in the early days of the colony, the primary transport mechanism was by ship. What I'm assisting councils to do is to understand what gets how wet, how often, what, if anything, can be done to manage that, and what plan they should implement to manage the risks to people and their property incumbent on occupying floodplains. People learned from these events in the past, and so that's why the majority of the development in the Shoalhaven is at Nowra and Bomaderry, because they're sitting up on hills. As soon as you get downstream of the bridge at Nowra, there's a big wide open flat floodplain that the water can spread out across. So that in the lower Shoalhaven area there are 3 floodplain risk management plans have been developed by council. There's one for the floodplain in general, there's one specifically for the Riverview Road area, and there's one specifically for Terera. And so development within the flood planning area is subject to flood development controls in council's development control plan and local environment plan.